Some love stories begin with fairy tales. Others start with desperation. This one began when a 19-year-old girl with nothing but hope in her heart answered a newspaper ad that would change 5 broken lives forever. Sarah Mitchell had exactly $47 to her name when she stepped off the train in Millfield, Texas, clutching a worn letter from a man she'd never met. James Crawford was a widowed cowboy with 5 children, a failing ranch, and a heart so shattered he'd forgotten what it meant to smile. What happened next defied every expectation, challenged every assumption about love, and proved that sometimes the most unlikely unions create the strongest bonds. This is their story, raw, real, and absolutely true. A story of how one young woman's courage and one broken man's desperate gamble transformed not just their lives, but an entire community. Nobody predicted what would unfold when these two strangers decided to build a life together. Nobody could have imagined the challenges they'd face, the love they'd discover, or the legacy they'd leave behind. This is the story nobody saw coming, but everyone needed to hear. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell stared at the crumpled newspaper in her hands, her fingers tracing the same advertisement she'd read dozens of times over the past week. The words seemed to blur together through her tears, but she knew them by heart now. Widowed rancher seeks wife. 5 children need mother. Hard work, but honest life. Write to James Crawford, Millfield, Texas. The boarding house room around her felt smaller each day, the walls closing in as her meager savings dwindled. 19 years old and completely alone in the world, Sarah had been working as a seamstress in Chicago since her aunt died 6 months ago. The small inheritance had barely covered the funeral costs, and now she faced a choice no young woman should have to make. Accept the questionable proposals from the men who frequented her workplace, or take a leap of faith that terrified her to her core. The letter she'd received 3 weeks after responding to the advertisement still lay folded on her nightstand. James Crawford's handwriting was neat but hurried, as if he'd written it late at night by lamplight. He'd been direct, almost brutally honest. His wife Margaret had died in childbirth 2 years ago, leaving him with 5 children ranging from 12 years old down to the baby who'd survived when his mother couldn't. The ranch was struggling, he admitted. He needed help, not just with the children but with everything. He couldn't pay a housekeeper, couldn't afford a nanny, and the neighboring women had their own families to worry about. Sarah had written back immediately, her heart pounding as she sealed the envelope. She'd told him about her aunt, about her sewing skills, about growing up helping her mother tend to younger siblings before the influenza took them all. She hadn't mentioned how desperately lonely she felt or how the city seemed to swallow her whole a little more each day. She hadn't mentioned that she sometimes went to bed hungry because she was saving every penny for train fare west. His second letter had contained $25 and a train ticket. "Come if you're serious," he'd written. "If it doesn't work out, I'll pay your way back to Chicago. But understand, this isn't a romance novel. This is 5 children who need someone to care about them, a ranch that's barely keeping us fed, and a man who's forgotten how to hope for much beyond surviving another day." Those words had sealed her decision. Sarah had grown up in a household where love was a luxury they couldn't afford, where every day was about survival, where taking care of others wasn't a choice, but a necessity. She understood that kind of life. She respected it, even. What she couldn't understand was the emptiness that had consumed her since arriving in Chicago, the feeling that she was disappearing a little more each day in a city full of strangers. The morning she decided to leave, Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house owner, had cornered her in the hallway. "You're making a mistake, child," the older woman had said, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Running off to marry some cowboy you've never met? You don't know anything about him. He could be a drunk, a violent man, anything at all." Sarah had looked at the woman who'd been nothing but cold to her since the day she'd arrived, who'd raised the rent twice despite knowing about Sarah's circumstances, who'd made it clear that young women without family weren't welcome to stay long. "I don't know anything about staying here either," Sarah had replied quietly. And at least he was honest about what he needs. The train journey to Texas had taken 3 days, and Sarah had spent every minute of it questioning her decision. She'd watched the landscape change from industrial cities to farmland to the vast, open spaces of Texas, and with each mile, she'd felt smaller and more uncertain. What did she know about ranching? What did she know about caring for 5 children? What did she know about anything beyond sewing seams and counting pennies? But then, she'd remembered the tone of James Crawford's letters. Not desperate, exactly, but tired in a way she recognized. The bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying more than one person should have to carry. She'd seen it in her mother's eyes during those last months, in her aunt's face after the doctor's bills had mounted up. It was the look of someone who'd stopped asking for help because they'd learned that help rarely came. The train had pulled into Millfield just as the sun was setting, painting the small town in shades of gold and orange. Sarah had gathered her single carpet bag and the small sewing kit that contained her most valuable possessions, her hands trembling as she stepped onto the platform. The station was nearly empty, just a few men loading cargo, and an older couple greeting someone from the train. She'd stood there for a moment, looking around for someone who might be James Crawford, when she'd heard footsteps behind her. "Miss Mitchell." The voice was rough, hesitant, and when she'd turned around, she'd found herself looking at a tall man with dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, but he looked older. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and too little sleep, and his clothes, while clean, were worn soft at the edges. "Mr. Crawford," she'd said, and was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. They'd looked at each other for a long moment, both clearly measuring the person against whatever they'd imagined. He was handsome, she'd realized with surprise. Not in the polished way of the men she'd known in Chicago, but in a weathered, honest way that made her think of old photographs. "I brought the wagon," he'd said finally, gesturing toward a modest vehicle hitched to 2 horses. "It's about a 40-minute ride to the ranch. The children are." He'd paused, as if searching for the right words. "They're curious about you. I hope you understand. They haven't had much reason to trust new people in their lives." As he'd helped her into the wagon, Sarah had noticed his hands. They were working hands, calloused and scarred, but gentle as he'd steadied her arm. "I understand," she'd said, and meant it. "I'm not here to replace anyone, Mr. Crawford. I'm here to help." The ride to the ranch had passed mostly in silence, but it hadn't been uncomfortable. James had pointed out landmarks as they drove, his voice warming slightly as he'd talked about the land. The general store where they got supplies once a month, the creek that ran along his property line, the old oak tree where his oldest boy liked to read when he could steal time from chores. "Tell me about them," Sarah had said when they were still about 10 minutes from the house. "The children, I mean. I want to know about them before I meet them." James had been quiet for so long that Sarah had wondered if she'd overstepped, but then he'd started talking. "Tommy's the oldest. He's 12, almost 13. He's been trying to be the man of the house since Margaret died, and it's too much for him. But I don't know how to tell him that without making him feel like he's failing. He's smart, reads everything he can get his hands on, but he works harder than any boy should have to." He'd shifted the reins to one hand, his voice growing softer. "Lucy's 10. She's got her mother's stubbornness and twice my temper. She's been taking care of the younger ones, cooking what she can, trying to keep everyone in line. She's angry about everything, and I don't blame her for it. A 10-year-old girl shouldn't have to raise babies." Sarah had felt her chest tighten as he'd continued. "The twins, Sam and Ben, are 7. They're good boys, but they're wild without someone to watch them proper. They get into everything, ask 1,000 questions a day, and they miss their mama something fierce. And then there's baby Emma. She's 2 now, barely remembers Margaret, but she knows something's missing. She's been looking for a mother in every woman she meets, and it breaks my heart every time." The house had appeared as they'd crested a small hill, and Sarah had felt her breath catch. It was bigger than she'd expected, a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, but even in the fading light, she could see the signs of neglect. Fence rails that needed mending, a garden that was more weeds than vegetables, toys scattered in the yard that nobody had energy to put away. "It needs work," James had said, following her gaze. "Everything needs work. The house, the land, the children, me." He'd turned to look at her then, his expression serious. "I want you to know what you're walking into, Sarah. This isn't going to be easy. There are days when I wonder if I'm doing right by any of them. keeping them out here when maybe they'd be better off with relatives in the city, in real schools, with people who know what they're doing. Sarah had looked at the house, at the vast Texas sky stretched out above it, at the man beside her who was trying so hard to be honest about his failures. "What do you want, Mr. Crawford?" she'd asked quietly. "Not what you think you should want, or what would be practical. What do you actually want?" He'd been quiet for a long moment, and when he'd finally spoken, his voice had been barely above a whisper. "I want them to be happy. I want to see Lucy smile again, really smile, not just that polite face she puts on for adults. I want the twins to be boys instead of little old men who worry about everything. I want Tommy to read his books without feeling guilty about not working. I want Emma to have someone who can sing her to sleep and teach her the things mothers teach daughters." He'd paused, swallowing hard. "And I want to believe that Margaret would understand why I'm doing this, why I need help, why I can't do it all alone anymore." Something had shifted in Sarah's chest at those words, a recognition of honesty so complete it took her breath away. "Then, that's what we'll work toward," she'd said simply. "Not perfection, not some idea of what a family should look like. Just happiness, in whatever form it takes." As they'd pulled up to the house, 5 faces had appeared in the windows, and Sarah had seen her future looking back at her with a mixture of hope and fear and desperate need. She'd thought about the empty boarding house room she'd left behind, about the newspaper advertisement that had changed everything, about the leap of faith that had brought her to this moment. "Are you ready?" James had asked, and Sarah had realized that ready or not, this was where her real life was about to begin. "I'm ready," she'd said, and meant every word. The first morning at the Crawford Ranch began before sunrise, and Sarah discovered quickly that James hadn't exaggerated about the challenges ahead. She'd spent her first night in Margaret's old sewing room, sleeping on a narrow bed surrounded by half-finished quilts and children's clothing that needed mending. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. She was literally sleeping in the space where a mother's work had been left undone. Emma had woken the household at 5:30, crying for someone who couldn't come. Sarah had heard James's heavy footsteps in the hallway, his quiet voice trying to soothe the toddler, and the frustrated sighs when his efforts failed. After 20 minutes of listening to the little girl's heartbroken sobs, Sarah had quietly opened her door. "May I try?" she'd whispered, and James had looked at her with such relief that it made her chest ache. Emma was small for 2 years old, with dark curls that hadn't been properly combed in days and eyes exactly like her father's. She'd regarded Sarah with the solemn wariness of a child who'd learned that new people usually meant more loss. But when Sarah had started singing softly, an old lullaby her own mother had sung, Emma's crying had gradually subsided. "Mama," Emma had whispered, and Sarah had felt her heart break a little. "No, sweetheart," Sarah had said gently, stroking the little girl's hair. "I'm Sarah. I'm here to help take care of you." It had taken another hour to get Emma back to sleep, and by then, the rest of the household was stirring. Sarah had dressed quickly and found her way to the kitchen, where Lucy was already attempting to make breakfast with the grim determination of a soldier preparing for battle. The 10-year-old had looked up when Sarah entered, her expression immediately defensive. "I can handle it," Lucy had said before Sarah could speak. "I've been doing the cooking since Mama died." Sarah had looked at the girl who was trying so hard to be grown up, at the burned eggs in the pan, and the flour scattered across every surface, and she'd felt a fierce surge of protective anger. Not at Lucy, but at the circumstances that had forced a child to shoulder such responsibilities. "I'm sure you can," Sarah had said carefully. "But I'm awake now, and I need something to do with my hands. Would you mind if I helped? I'm used to keeping busy, and I don't know where anything is yet." Lucy had studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing whether this was a challenge to her authority or a genuine offer of partnership. "You can make the biscuits," she'd said finally. "But I do the eggs. Tommy likes them a certain way." They'd worked together in tentative harmony, and Sarah had been impressed despite herself by Lucy's competence. The girl knew her way around the kitchen, knew each family member's preferences, knew how to stretch ingredients to make them last. What she lacked was experience and the luxury of making mistakes, burdens no child should carry. Tommy had appeared as they were setting the table, already dressed for the day despite the early hour. He was tall for 12, with his father's serious eyes and an air of responsibility that made Sarah want to wrap him in a quilt and tell him to go play. Instead, she'd simply said good morning and asked if he preferred his coffee black or with milk. "You don't have to treat me like an adult," Tommy had said, but his tone was more curious than defensive. "I know I'm just a kid." "You're a kid who drinks coffee and does a man's work," Sarah had replied. "That seems adult enough to me." The twins had thundered down the stairs like a small stampede, identical boys with gap-toothed grins and an energy that seemed to fill the entire room. They'd stopped short when they'd seen Sarah, suddenly, shy in the way children become when they remember they're supposed to be on their best behavior. "Are you going to be our new mama?" Ben had asked with the brutal honesty that only 7-year-olds possess. The question had made everyone freeze. Lucy had tensed, Tommy had stared at his plate, and even James, who'd just entered the kitchen, had gone still. Sarah had felt the weight of 5 pairs of eyes watching her response, measuring her worthiness against a ghost. "I'm going to be Sarah," she'd said simply. "I'm going to help your papa take care of you, and help you take care of each other, and maybe we'll figure out what that looks like as we go. But will you love us like a mama would?" Sam had pressed, and Sarah had realized that this was the question they were all asking in their own ways. "I don't know how to love like your mama did," Sarah had admitted. "But I know how to love like Sarah does, and I think that might be enough if you'll let it be." It was James who had broken the silence that followed, clearing his throat and asking the boys about their morning chores. But Sarah had caught the look he'd given her, surprised, approving, grateful, and she'd known she'd passed some kind of test. The first weeks had been an exercise in learning each other's rhythms and boundaries. Sarah had discovered that Tommy got up early to read by lamplight before his chores began, stealing moments with books the way other boys might steal cookies. She'd started leaving her own lamp burning in the kitchen, creating a quiet space where he could sit with his stories without feeling guilty about the oil he was using. Lucy had been the hardest to win over, watching Sarah's every move with the critical eye of someone who'd been let down before. The breakthrough had come when Sarah had found her crying over a torn dress, Margaret's dress that Lucy had been trying to alter for herself. "I can't make it fit right," Lucy had sobbed, and in that moment, she'd sounded like the lost little girl she was instead of the fierce guardian she'd been forced to become. "May I see?" Sarah had asked, and spent the next 2 hours teaching Lucy how to properly take in seams, how to adjust a pattern for a smaller frame, how to make something beautiful from something broken. "Mama used to sew," Lucy had said quietly as they worked. "I know," Sarah had replied. "I can see her stitches in some of the quilts. She was very skilled. Do you think she'd mind that I'm wearing her dress?" Sarah had looked at the girl who was trying so hard to hold on to pieces of a mother she barely remembered, and she'd felt a fierce protective love settle in her chest like a living thing. "I think she'd be proud to see how beautiful you look in it. And I think she'd be proud of how well you've been taking care of everyone." The twins had been easier in some ways, their affection freely given once they decided Sarah wasn't going to disappear. They'd attached themselves to her skirts like small satellites, chattering constantly, and bringing her everything from interesting rocks to dead insects with equal enthusiasm. But they'd also been harder in ways she hadn't expected, wild and grieving in turns, needing constant attention and reassurance that she wasn't going anywhere. Emma had been the biggest challenge and the greatest reward. The toddler had been slow to warm up, clinging to her father with desperate intensity and regarding Sarah with deep suspicion. But gradually, as Sarah had proved her consistency, always there for morning meals, always available for hurt feelings and scraped knees, Emma had begun to tentatively reach out. The first time Emma had called her Sarah Mama, Sarah had felt something crack open in her chest. Not quite love yet, but the space where love could grow. James had watched these developments with a mixture of relief and something that looked like amazement. Sarah had caught him sometimes, standing in doorways and observing as she braided Lucy's hair or helped the twins with their letters or rocked Emma to sleep. His expression had been hard to read, grateful, certainly, but also something deeper, as if he was seeing possibilities he'd forgotten existed. "You're good with them," he'd said one evening after the children were in bed. They'd been sitting on the porch, sharing coffee and the comfortable quiet that came after a day of honest work. "They're good children," Sarah had replied. They just needed someone to see that. Margaret would have liked you, James had said, and Sarah had known it was the highest compliment he could give. The work had been relentless. Cooking, cleaning, mending, mediating children's arguments, helping with homework, nursing scraped knees, and hurt feelings. But it had also been fulfilling in a way that surprised her. Each small success, Lucy laughing at something silly, Tommy accepting help without guilt, the twins going a whole day without a major catastrophe, Emma falling asleep in her arms, had felt like building something important. The neighboring ranchers had been curious about the new addition to the Crawford household, and their wives had come calling with barely disguised intentions to inspect the young woman who'd married their neighbor. Sarah had understood that she was being evaluated, measured against their expectations of what a rancher's wife should be. Mrs. Henderson from the adjacent property had been particularly direct. "You're awfully young," she'd observed over coffee and cake. "Marriage and motherhood aren't games for girls to play at." "No, they're not," Sarah had agreed. "They're responsibilities that require everything you have to give. Age doesn't determine whether someone is ready for that kind of commitment. 5 children is a lot to take on for someone who's never had any of her own," Mrs. Henderson had continued, clearly probing for weakness. Sarah had looked through the kitchen window where the twins were showing Emma how to feed the chickens while Lucy supervised, and Tommy read nearby, ready to help if needed. "You're right," she'd said. "But I didn't take on 5 children. I joined a family that needed someone who could love them as they are, not as they might have been in different circumstances." The conversation had shifted after that, and when Mrs. Henderson had left, she'd grudgingly admitted that Sarah seemed to have her head on straight. Coming from the area's unofficial arbiter of respectability, it was as good as a public endorsement. But the real test had come during Emma's first fever, a terrifying night when the toddler's temperature had spiked and she'd become listless and unresponsive. Sarah had sat up all night with her, applying cool cloths and forcing small sips of water, while James had paced the house like a caged animal. "She's dying," he'd whispered at one point, his voice breaking. "Just like Margaret. I can't lose her too." "She's not dying," Sarah had said firmly, though her own fear had been a living thing in her throat. "Children get fevers. Her breathing is clear, her color is good. She just needs time and care." She'd been right, and by morning Emma's fever had broken, but the night had changed something between Sarah and James. He'd seen her steady in a crisis, had trusted her with his most precious thing, and she'd proven worthy of that trust. "Thank you," he'd said simply as Emma had slept peacefully in Sarah's arms, and Sarah had understood that he meant for more than just nursing his daughter through a fever. 3 months after her arrival, Sarah had realized that the empty space in her chest, the loneliness that had driven her from Chicago, had been filled with something she'd never expected to find. Not romantic love, not yet, but something deeper and more complex. The satisfaction of being needed, the joy of watching broken things heal, the comfort of belonging somewhere. She'd also realized that James was watching her with different eyes now, not just as the woman who'd answered his advertisement, but as someone who'd exceeded every expectation he'd allowed himself to have. The change in their relationship had been gradual, built on shared responsibilities and mutual respect rather than grand gestures. They'd become partners in the truest sense, working together toward the common goal of healing a family that had been shattered by loss. And, slowly, carefully, they'd both begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were building something beautiful from the pieces of their broken lives. 6 months into their arrangement, disaster struck the Crawford Ranch in the form of an early spring storm that nobody saw coming. Sarah had been in town with Lucy, buying supplies and fabric for new school clothes, when the wind had begun to pick up. What started as a typical Texas squall had quickly turned vicious, with hail the size of hens' eggs and winds that bent the prairie grass flat to the ground. They'd barely made it back to the ranch before the worst of it hit, and Sarah's heart had stopped when she'd seen the damage. The storm had torn the roof off the barn, scattered lumber and tools across the yard like toys, and, worst of all, spooked the cattle so badly that half the herd had broken through the fence and disappeared into the vast Texas landscape. James had been standing in the wreckage of his livelihood, his face gray with shock and defeat. The twins clung to his legs while Tommy tried to comfort Emma, who was crying at the chaos around her. It was the first time Sarah had seen him truly broken, and the sight had filled her with a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. "How bad is it?" she'd asked quietly, once the children were inside, and temporarily distracted with hot chocolate and stories. James had run his hands through his hair, a gesture she'd learned meant he was fighting despair. "Bad enough," he'd said. "Maybe too bad. I had most of my savings tied up in that herd, and without the barn, I can't properly shelter what stock I have left. The fence repairs alone will cost more than I have, and that's assuming I can find the cattle before they're scattered to 4 counties. He'd sat down heavily at the kitchen table, suddenly, looking older than his 30 years. "I've been thinking maybe it's time to admit I can't do this anymore. My brother in Kansas has offered to take the children before. They'd have better opportunities there, real schools, chances I can't give them here." Sarah had felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And what about us? What about what we've built here? What have we built, Sarah?" James had asked, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "A failing ranch, and a family held together by stubbornness and hope? Maybe that's not enough. Maybe I've been selfish, keeping them here when they could have better lives elsewhere." That night, after the children were finally asleep, Sarah had made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. She'd gone to James, who was sitting on the porch staring out at the damaged landscape, and she'd laid out a plan that was equal parts practical and revolutionary. "I have money," she'd said without preamble. "Not much, but enough. The inheritance from my aunt that I've been saving. It's enough to rebuild the barn and repair the fences." James had turned to stare at her. "Sarah, I can't take your money. You need that for your future, for security." "This is my future," she'd said firmly. "These children, this ranch, this life we're building together. This is what I want to secure. But what if it fails again? What if I can't make it work? You'd lose everything." Sarah had sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "James, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about not being able to give the children better opportunities. But what if better doesn't mean different? What if it means making what we have work?" She'd pulled out a piece of paper covered with her careful calculations. "I've been watching how this ranch operates, and I think I see some problems that aren't just about bad luck or weather. You're trying to do everything the way it's always been done, but that doesn't mean it's the best way for our circumstances." Over the next hour, Sarah had outlined a plan that would revolutionize how they thought about the ranch. Instead of focusing solely on cattle, which required large herds and extensive grazing land they couldn't afford to maintain, she suggested diversifying. Chickens for eggs and meat, a large vegetable garden that could feed the family and provide surplus for town, and, most importantly, a sewing business that could provide steady income during the lean months. "I can take in alterations and mending from town," she'd explained. "Lucy's getting good with a needle too, and there's always demand for quality needlework. It's not glamorous, but it's reliable income that doesn't depend on weather or cattle prices." James had listened with growing interest as she'd continued. "And Tommy is smart enough to help with the business side. He could keep books, handle correspondence. Instead of seeing his love of reading as time away from ranch work, we could make it part of the ranch's success. What about the twins and Emma? Children can contribute too, in age-appropriate ways. The twins could help tend the chickens and gather eggs. Emma could help me sort buttons and thread. Everyone has something valuable to offer." But the most revolutionary part of Sarah's plan hadn't been about money or diversification. It had been about partnership. "I want to be your wife," she'd said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Not just the woman who keeps house and minds the children, but your true partner in all of this. Legal partnership, equal say in decisions, shared ownership of what we build together." James had been quiet for so long that Sarah had begun to worry she'd overstepped. But when he'd finally spoken, his voice had been thick with emotion. "Are you sure? Marriage to me means being tied to all of this chaos, all this uncertainty. You're young, Sarah. You could still find someone who could give you an easier life." "I don't want easier," Sarah had said. "I want meaningful. I want this family, this challenge, this chance to build something important with someone I respect and care about." "Care about?" James had asked, and Sarah had heard the question underneath the question. "Love," she'd corrected quietly. "I love you, James." Not the desperate love of someone who needs rescuing, but the deep love of someone who's chosen to build a life with you. I love your stubbornness and your honesty and the way you love those children. I love how hard you work and how you never give up, even when you should. I love the man you are and the man you're becoming. The kiss that followed had been soft and tentative at first, then deeper as James had responded with surprise and gratitude and something that felt very much like hope. They'd been married the following week in a simple ceremony at the Methodist church in town, with the children as witnesses and half the county in attendance. Sarah had worn Margaret's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, with Lucy's careful help and blessing. Mama would want someone to get married in it, Lucy had said as they'd worked together to adjust the seams. She'd like that her dress got to be part of something happy again. The wedding itself had been nothing like the fairy tale ceremonies Sarah had dreamed of as a girl, but it had been perfect in its own way. Tommy had stood up as James's best man, proud and serious in his responsibility. Lucy had been Sarah's attendant, glowing with the importance of her role. The twins had scattered wildflowers instead of rice, and Emma had clapped her hands and called out "Mama" when the preacher had pronounced them husband and wife. But it was what happened after the wedding that had truly tested their new partnership. The process of rebuilding had been backbreaking work, requiring every member of the family to contribute in ways they'd never imagined. Sarah had thrown herself into establishing the sewing business, working late into the night to complete orders while still managing household duties. The income had been modest but steady, and word had spread quickly about the quality of her work. Lucy had proven to have a real talent for embroidery, and soon they were taking orders for decorative pieces that commanded higher prices. Tommy had indeed shown an aptitude for bookkeeping, carefully tracking expenses and income with the precision of someone twice his age. The twins had appointed themselves chief chicken wranglers and had taken their duties seriously, reporting daily on egg counts and the health of their feathered charges. Most surprisingly, James had proven to be an excellent partner in ways Sarah hadn't expected. He'd listened to her ideas without defensiveness, had implemented suggestions that improved efficiency, and had begun to see the ranch not just as a place where he worked, but as a business they were building together. The first real test of their new dynamic had come when a neighboring rancher had offered to buy a significant portion of their land at a price that would have solved their financial problems immediately. "It's good money," James had said as they discussed the offer over dinner. "More than we could make ranching this land in the next 5 years, probably." "But then what?" Sarah had asked. "We'd have money, but no future, no way to generate more income. It feels like selling our security for temporary relief." The old James might have made the decision unilaterally, driven by fear and the immediate pressure of financial stress. But the new James had called for a family meeting, laying out the pros and cons of the offer and asking everyone's opinion. "I want to stay," Tommy had said immediately. "This is home now. And Sarah's right. We're finally starting to make things work." "The chickens like it here," Ben had added seriously. "Moving would upset them." Even Emma, in her limited vocabulary, had contributed by clapping when asked if she wanted to stay in their house. They'd turned down the offer, and 3 months later, they'd been proven right when a drought had devastated the crops on the land they'd considered selling. Their diversified approach had allowed them to weather the dry spell better than many of their neighbors. By the end of their first year as a married couple, the Crawford Ranch had become something neither Sarah nor James had imagined possible. Not just a successful operation, but a true partnership where each person's strengths were valued and utilized. The children were thriving in ways that went beyond simple happiness. They were becoming confident, capable people who understood their own worth and potential. Tommy had started helping other ranchers with their bookkeeping, earning extra income while developing skills that would serve him well in any future he chose. Lucy had begun teaching other girls in town how to embroider, sharing her knowledge while building friendships with children her